part of the reason that's happening is that we have some of the best leaders in education resident in our city, some of whom are homegrown, some of whom have come here because of the opportunity. And so I'm going to quickly introduce them to you all, and then we'll get right to the meat of the coconut. Accomplishments, which you probably have their bios. So it's Brad Leon, who's the Chief Innovation Officer for Shelby County Unified Schools. So pleased, Brad, sorry you came to Memphis for Teach for America. Distinguished teacher, distinguished leader of Teach for America, and now leading the charge embedded within the district, stirring up all kinds of great things. And you'll hear about how the iZone is an example of the great work we're doing in partnership with a portfolio approach to school reform. Chris Barbick, who's the head of the Achievement School District. Chris will tell you about that. Chris came to us from Yes College Prep in Houston, one of the highest performing charter management organizations in the country. People said, you're never going to get Chris Barbick. And a few of us said, oh, yes, we are. But actually, we didn't have to twist his arm that much because he saw the opportunity in Tennessee.
Right.
Was pleased to come work for Governor Haslam to lead the charge. Derwin Cisnet is the Chief Executive Officer of Gestalt Community Schools, and our host here, Humes, is a part of the Gestalt portfolio. Derwin has a background in business and real estate development, and has come to the work of being an educator and leading that charge in a great way. Power Center is one of the highest performing schools, the original Power Center, and now he's expanding that portfolio. Rosalind Webb, who is the executive director of Freedom Prep. Rosalind is an attorney, came to Memphis originally as within the district, and then deputy director of New Leaders for New Schools, which is designed to create great principal leadership, and now running Freedom Prep, which was just awarded SCORE. Jamie scores top prize for highest performing school in the state. And then Philip Nelson, who is a veteran teacher and leader, principal at Chickasaw Middle School, and I have to refer to my notes because these numbers are just so stunning. Chickasaw Middle School had, people say it's hard to move the needle, it's hard to create student achievement gains. Chickasaw Middle, in his second year of leadership, earned gains, 27% gains in math, 18.7% in science, 16.2% in social studies. Those are unprecedented double-digit gains that are extraordinary and really are one example of how leadership matters and the kind of work he's doing. So with that, I'm going to just frame the conversation a little bit by telling you what our goals are. Our goals are to help you understand where we're going in Memphis, the kind of leadership that we're bringing to bear, the multiple achievements, multiple approach portfolio that we have here, and let you see the kind of leadership that's aligning to do this work. I saw Chris Barbick at a luncheon last week, and I can't remember if it was Brad Martin, who is our president of the University of Memphis, or Chris, who used the term Navy SEALs. This is really the kind of talent, I mean, the Navy SEALs, the Green Berets, the Army Rangers of education is who's sitting at this table. So I'm going to start out by asking Chris, Chris, in a nutshell, explain to this group the Achievement School District, what its goals are, and how it fits into the big picture of the opportunity in Memphis particularly, but statewide.
Sure. Welcome, everybody. So yeah, let me just give you a quick thumbnail on the ASD. So the Achievement School District was started out of the Race to the Top application that Tennessee received several years ago. It was a $500 million initiative, key part of President Obama's education reform plan in his first administration. And it funded many statewide initiatives, and there were 4 key areas that the application needed to address. One of those was, what was the state going to do for its consistently, persistently lowest performing schools? And we define those as schools that are in the bottom 5%. There's 85 campuses that are ASD eligible. 68 of those campuses are here in Memphis. There's a small cluster in Nashville, a small cluster in Chattanooga, one in Knoxville, and one in Hardeman County. And when the ASD brings a school under its jurisdiction, right now we have 16 schools, 15 of them are here in Memphis. We have 1 school in Nashville. 10 of the schools are charter schools, so where we're sitting right now, Humes is one of those schools. We're partnering with Derwin, as Barbara mentioned, and this is not only a Gestalt charter school, it's also an Achievement School District school. We're also running 6 schools ourselves. So we have a cluster of schools in Fraser, which is just north of here. We're running 6 schools, 4 elementaries, a middle, and a 9th grade academy. And what we do when we bring the school in is we do one of those 2 things. We either convert the school to a charter school or we run the school ourselves. And either way, there's really 4 key things we're looking for. One is we want to make sure we have the right leader and the right people in the building. And then our approach is to give those people the autonomy they need around 4 key areas. One is they got to be able to build their own team. You can't thrust teachers upon a leader who may or may not believe in that person, may or may not believe in their mission, and may or may not believe the kids in that building can actually learn. And so we think it's extremely important that the first key autonomy is that you put the right leader in the building and you give them the ability to build their own team. It's any of you coming from the private sector, it's a no-brainer, right? Unfortunately, in education, that's a big aha, or has been up until maybe 4 or 5 years ago. 2 is you got to give people autonomy over program. So it can't be me sitting in an office in Nashville or somebody sitting in a central office saying, this is the reading program we're going to use, this is the math program we're going to use. You've got to give people closest to the kids the ability to make the decisions around what matter most around program, because they're the ones closest to the kids and they know better than anybody around what types of initiatives and programs need to be implemented. 3 is folks have to have autonomy around budget. We can't carve off 50, 60% of the per pupil to cover a big central office overhead and then give the rest to the school. We push 98% of the per pupil dollars down to the campus level so that, again, folks in the school not only can make decisions, but then have the resources to be able to apply against the goals that they've set so they can actually get the work done. And lastly, you got to give people autonomy around time. A 7 to 2 o'clock school day isn't good for anybody. It's especially not good for kids that are in the bottom 5%. We need more time if we're going to catch kids up. So the bottom line is great teaching, more of it, and give people the autonomy they need to make the decisions that matter most.
Hello, everyone, and I want to say thank you to you, Barbara, for pulling this all together. Just incredibly humbled to be in Memphis, and the Hyde Foundation's leadership has been incredible. So our mission in the innovation department is twofold. One is to deliver immediate and dramatic advances in student achievement, and second is to create the conditions by which...
We need to talk louder.
Okay.
And Wes, why don't you stand up when you're answering the question? That'll help. Okay, you guys speak up if you're still not hearing, okay?
Okay. I'm going to take you, Melody, as my cue. So our mission at the innovation department is twofold. First is to immediately increase student achievement that are scalable, and second is to ensure that we're creating the conditions for the system of the future. And for me, the system of the future is very much like what Chris has identified. In my opinion, there are 3 important conditions that we need to ensure that our educators are making the choices on, not our central office administrators. The first is hiring. Do our principals have the ability to hire their own team? Second is strategy, and I'm including time in strategy. Are we letting principals decide what the strategy on the building level is going to be? And finally, budget. If we're not going to give our principals the opportunity to decide on their budget, we might as well not give them instructional strategy either, because their budget is going to determine their instructional strategy. And we're not all the way there yet at the I-Zone. But the I-Zone was created by the state to give districts the same ability as what the ASD has. So in legislation, the I-Zones were created so long as districts were willing to buy into certain reforms, and our district has. And so Mr. Nelson at Chickasaw Middle is one of our strongest principals. And the way that we work with Chris is, I think, very collaboratively. I mean, I think I've heard him say frenemies and co-opetition. And I see that, just like any business would, is that of course you've got to have really strong competitors to keep yourself sharp. Iron sharpens iron. But Chris is a personal friend, and the folks who work in the ASD are people who I consider friends for a long time. So what I would like to think is that we're all in this for the same purpose, actually pursuing a very similar kinds of strategy. As you might imagine, in a district, we have a little bit more work to do to ensure that the kind of flexibilities that an ASD principal has is the same flexibility that our Innovation Zone principals has, but we're very hard at work at that.
Can I add one quick thing? I swear it'll be short. So just to give you an example of what this means, So I mentioned there were 68 schools in Memphis that were in the bottom 5%. When we get done with the community matching process, which we'll finish up this December, in 24 months' time, every single one of those 68 schools will either be in the I zone, in the ASD, closed, or making 8 to 10 point gains. Now, we could never have done that in 24 months by ourselves. I don't think the district could have either. So the fact that together we were able to spread our resources, invest our race to the top dollars, work with the district collaboratively, identify which school made the most sense. In 24 months' time, we've got the equivalent of a very large school district in the state. We think on track where every single one of those schools has a plan to get better. And I think that's just a good example of how when we work together, this can actually get done pretty quickly.
If I might, I hate that.
Achievement School District.
Okay, so how does that lie within the system itself? Do you segregate yourself out within the school system?
We're completely separate from the local district. When we take a school, we take it out of local control.
And how does that accomplish by we take it out?
It was created by the legislature.
Yeah, please, Brad.
And I also think Chris hit on something that's important to note. At least so far in the innovation zone, we haven't done anything that's particularly innovative, because what we've done is say a principal should be able to hire their team, decide on their strategy, and have control over their budget. And even though that doesn't sound innovative, like Chris said, in the world of education, that is leaps and bounds beyond what a normal principal in a district in this state has. They don't get to decide who's on their team, they don't get to decide on their strategy, and they don't get to decide on their budget.
We give our principals the per pupil dollars, and we sit down with them and help them budget and manage those dollars against whatever goals they've set. So in most places, you ask a principal how much money is actually under their discretion. It's, at best, well, I mean, I don't know what it is in the I zone, but in typical district schools, it's maybe, a few $100,000 out of, if you add up the number of kids and multiply it by 8,400, is a multi-million-dollar budget. Principals don't have control over those resources. They get told what to do with those by someone in the central office.
I think one thing that you're going to see as you hear from each of these folks up here is that it's an illustration of the fact that Memphis, I think, is leading the way in going from a kind of one-size-fits-all monolithic system with one governance model and a lot of prescriptions to a network of people that's robust, that's allowing people to experiment, to have the freedom to lead, to drive student gains. And what's interesting about this in terms of the landscape of national education reform is we've demonstrated nationally that you can create great schools, individual schools, pockets of excellence within a district. No entire system has made significant progress toward allowing this kind of autonomy, freedom, relentless focus on student achievement, and the kind of policies embedded to support it that are going to drive change system-wide. And so to me, that's the opportunity we have here. Obviously, there are challenges embedded in that, but that's what I think you're going to see in this and why we think Memphis is potentially a proof point nationally. Derwin, I want to be sure we hear from each one of our folks quickly, and then we'll really open it up for questions. So, Derwin, in addition to having strong academic outcomes, Gestalt Community Schools focuses on catalyzing community leadership. Tell us what led to that decision and how that particular part of the culture of Gestalt drives change.
So, can everyone hear me? Okay. I wish I could say I was smart enough to come up with the idea of community approach to academic excellence, but really I kind of fell into it. I was running a community development corporation in 2007, and I was charged with starting a charter school. And out of that, I pretty much had to have my community development cap on while looking at starting a school. And so we saw the opportunity not just to create an academic model, but really to address the needs of a particular community. For those of you who are familiar with Memphis, there's a community in Memphis called Hickory Hill. And before the recession, before we knew there was a recession, this community identified with everyone who identified with the recession. Businesses were leaving, families were filing for bankruptcy and foreclosure, and pretty much there was not only an academic academic need, but there was a social and economic need. And so what we did was we looked at our model and really just flipped it on its head and said, instead of just having core math, science, social studies, reading, why don't we add business as a core subject? And why don't we partner with the local businesses in the community so that we could develop a model that actually is hands-on, project-based learning, problem-based learning. And so what that looked like then was, by 2008, and I like to say maybe, hopefully Barbara and Teresa don't mind, but really with $25,000 seed money from the Hyde Foundation, we created our model, and our 6th grade class with 125 scholars started with a business class in a partnership with SunTrust Bank, where our scholars weren't only learning about how to save money, they were actually shadowing bank tellers and then operating and running their own savings bank within the school, and they do that every day to this day. So that was more of an approach to say, well, it's not enough to just say 2 + 2 = 4. What if you put your money into a bank and saw what that did? What if you kept adding that over time? And really, we look at the 10,000-hour rule. If you look at our model, starting with 6th grade all the way through 12th grade, our scholars would have spent 10,000 hours doing this work. And so they wouldn't just learn about just your core subjects. They would learn about giving back to the community, partnering with the community. And so there's the soft side of community development, but then there's also the hard side of community development. And again, having my community development cap on, when we started running out of space to serve our kids, we realized there was an opportunity not just to build a school, but to build a microcosm of a healthy community. And so we eliminated about 43 acres of blight in the Hickory Hill community, an old abandoned apartment complex, which was about 394 units of housing, completely blighted, some burned down, broken down. It was declared a public nuisance. And we were able to eliminate that, and we'll be building our middle school and high school there. And we worked with FEMA to, they funded pretty much a performing arts center that will double as a tornado safe space when there's not a tornado. When there's not a performing arts program going on. And we're looking at creative opportunities to redevelop that community, but not just to do it from a building standpoint, but also building social capital, building our community at the same time. And so when we talk about models and what it looks like in each community, as we decided to grow our model, we realized it's not just Power Center Academy that the model works where we go. It's about really looking at a community's needs, identifying with their assets, and building a model around that. And so in Humes, it looks nothing like Power Center Academy, quite frankly. Humes is about a mile away from downtown, a mile away from the research corridor, science and bioworks, and it's also a mile away from the arts community. And so it wouldn't make sense for us to develop a model that only addressed business and academics. It would make sense for us to address a model that addressed arts and sciences. And so our model here is based on arts and sciences. And of course, Elvis went here, so why would we forget the art fact? And so when you look at this model, we're now partnering with about 8 other founding partners to redevelop an old Sears building down the street. It's about 1.5 million square feet of space. It's been empty for about 20 years, and now we're working with St. Jude Research Hospital, Rhodes College, Church Health Center, Crosstown Arts, a bunch of wonderful partners to redevelop that space, and this school will grow into that high school that will be based on the arts and sciences. And we'll talk about collaboration where you have scientists from St. Jude that they will be able to sit down and have lunch with our scholars who want to be scientists. You'll have artists visiting from across the world who are living in that space from Crosstown Arts, and they'll be able to partner with our scholars who want to be artists. And so here's an opportunity again to be more hands-on with our approach and not just worry about what's happening in the classroom, but think about what's happening in the community.
Just to highlight a couple of things that Derwin said. First of all, all of you are involved in giving as philanthropists, companies, and as leaders. Talk about a good ROI, $25,000 investment. People say there's not enough money to reform public education. There is. I mean, this is an incredible payback. And 2 things I hear in this, and that is, often we hear people say, well, you can't just reform schools. You have to deal with community-wide issues, the issues embedded in the family, poverty, the neighborhood challenges, crime, and it's just too big. We can't do it. I think what Power Center and Gestalt are doing are showing how the school and schools can be anchors in the community and be a nucleus for doing that community-wide transformation. And it's so incredibly powerful. So thank you. So Roblin, you're a score. I think when I introduced you, I said you're a score winner, and that's just because I think it's a foregone conclusion. No pressure, JB, but a finalist. Okay. So say a few words about why Freedom Prep, how you got there, why Freedom Prep is a finalist, and how what you're doing there demonstrates what's possible for all schools.
So Freedom Prep started in the fall of 2009. I actually did a fellowship called Building Excellent Schools, which is a national fellowship to train professionals across the country to open these high-performing college preparatory charter schools. And so what Freedom Prep has done to get to this point, our sole mission is to prepare all of our students that enter the building to excel in college and in life. It is vitally important that we prepare our kids to be able to enter any college. Our philosophy is that college and education is freedom. It really gives you the freedom of choices. As Barbara stated, I'm a reformed attorney, so I'm on career number 3 right now. I'm a reformed attorney, work for an education nonprofit, and now a founder and leader of a school. But the reason I was able to do that was because of my college education. I graduated from Rhodes College here in Memphis and got other degrees, but then came back to Memphis. The main reason I think Freedom Prep has been able to get where we are is because we focus specifically on culture and creating a really strong school culture, adult and student culture, that is able to allow us to teach and get to those high academic gains. When you walk into Freedom Prep, when you walk into a middle school, just like you walked into here, you didn't hear anything. And that's really important to us. So we maximize instructional time by the structures and the systems that we use in the school. We teach our kids from day one. The very first week of school is basically Freedom Prep boot camp. And so we teach our kids the hand signals they use in class. Hand signals so that you are not, and you're getting a little preview, Jamie, of what goes on in Freedom Prep, but we teach them hand signals in class. So when they have to go to the restroom, they cross their fingers like this versus interrupting a lesson saying, I've got to go to the bathroom. We teach them how to speak in college voice, how to speak in library voice. So there's certain instances where you speak how to speak in restaurant voice, so in the cafeteria. So we have a really strong focus on what this culture, we're really intentional about what our culture should look like, so there are no distractions, there's no room for error, so that our teachers have the most instructional time as possible. The other piece of it that we focus on, and I really appreciate that Derwin and they focus on community development, we focus on character and internal character development with our kids. Because we always tell them it does not matter how sharp you are, the strongest grades you have, if you do not know how to articulate yourself, if you do not know how to dress for interviews, if you do not know how to behave, you will not be successful in life. So we start out teaching our kids our core values from day one, which are respect, responsibility, integrity, excellence, and community is one of our core values as well, and what that means. So every day when things happen, if a child finds $1 on the ground and they give it back, we say, oh wow, you're showing the core value of excellence or responsibility or integrity as well. And so the reason we've been able to make those academic gains is not only the character development, also the culture of the school, but we also have a really intense, almost like business science focus on the academic data. And so we take specific full days of data days. Our professional development days are data days where we look at the assessments of every single child and say, okay, why did 50% of the kids pick B on this answer versus picking C? And then what do we have to do to tweak our instruction based on what these kids did? So it's more of a scientific approach, and I know that other charter schools do that as well, but it's a scientific approach to looking at that data and looking at those numbers and moving the instructional needle because of that. And so we've constantly done that, and I think the last thing that we've done is we are constantly working on improving ourselves. We are always looking for opportunities for professional development. I spend a lot of money out of our budget to send my teachers and my instructional leaders to different schools across the country that are knocking it out of the park. There are schools with the same demographic that we have, 100% minority students, almost 100% poverty, free and reduced lunch, where 100% of their kids are going to college. We need to see what they're doing. What we do is send people. We spend money to send them to Boston, New York, DC to see what these schools are doing, and we steal. I mean, we are basically thieves. We copycat exactly what they're doing. If it works for their kids, it's going to work for our kids. And so we're constantly focusing on improving ourselves. So when SCORE comes to visit, we will ask, what else should we be doing? What do you see that's not going right here? Because we're constantly trying to improve our practice to ensure that all of our kids are ready and academically ready for college.
Double-digit gains. Help us understand, coming from more within the traditional system, but now being an innovation zone school, help us understand, what have you done at Chickasaw Middle that's created those great gains, and how does being a part of the innovation zone help you accomplish that? What kind of autonomies do you have?
A lot of places where I differ from the panel is I've been in education now for 14 years. This has been my only career. I've had other jobs, but I haven't had any other career outside of the educational field. when I came to Chickasaw, this is my 3rd year, but this is the 2nd year of the I-Zone. And when we got the announcement back in February of 3 years ago, a lot of the teachers were worried, things like that, but what it allowed me to do, it was my 1st year as a principal. And I tell people all the time that this was really kind of a perfect storm for me as the principal, because what also happened at that time is the legislature said that we had to go into classrooms as administration and observe teachers at least 4 times if they were a tenured professional licensed teacher, and 6 times if they were not a professional licensed teacher. So what this allowed me to do is, in that year, not even knowing we were going into I-Zone, allowed me to see the educational practices, both for announced and unannounced observations, to see the quality of instruction of the teachers already within the building. We get the announcement February the 29th of 2012, and then my assistant principal and I, honestly not even knowing that we were going to have our own jobs back, because everybody had to reapply for their job, started sitting down and talking about, okay, if we get our jobs back, what are we going to do? Who are we going to hold on to? Who's effective? Who's having the right impact? Who fits into what we're trying to do as an admin team? And so fortunately, Dr. Griffin and her staff saw something in me and said, we're going to go ahead and retain. And then I retained my assistant principal, who I got to bring with me. At the end of the 2012 year, we had modest gains. We had about 2.5% bumps in everything. But we really wanted to focus on teacher effectiveness. Everybody comes up to me now and says, hey, you did a great job at the school. I look at them and I smile and said, the first thing I tell them is, I didn't teach the first child. I'm a firm believer in what Jim Collins says about effective leadership is you defer to the people that work for you. The one thing I can't take credit for, though, is I hired them. And so we put a real emphasis on the teacher effectiveness, because even with the hour of intervention, things like that, you can intervene all day, but if you don't have an effective teacher leading that intervention, it's worthless. And so we went out, I tell people all the time, I love hiring season. I love when it's time to go get teachers, because I'm on the phone. I equate myself to Josh Pashner. And so I go out there, I'm on the phone, I'm trying to get the best talent available for my kids. And because if I put an effective teacher in front of them, then the data, the pushing the students, things like that, the belief in the children already comes with it. The other thing that I would also say, as far as so the autonomy as far as hiring is one of the biggest autonomies we use to get the gains that we have. But the other biggest autonomy that we utilized was the autonomy in curricular programming. And a good example of this at my school is when we came in 2012, we had about 8% of our students proficient or advanced in math. The district policy normally is, if you're going to have Algebra 1 classes, that they have to be already proficient or advanced. Now, 8% of my kids from 2012 were proficient and advanced, and the majority of them, to be honest with you, were in 8th grade and now in high school, so that didn't really do me any good, except I had the autonomy of curricular planning. And so what I did is I looked at my students, looked at the data, took my students that were proficient and advanced, took my high basic kids, and I remember talking with my Algebra 1 teachers, and we're sitting there and I was nervous. I'm not necessarily one to kick against the grain, but I knew that we had to do something. And so they showed me a lack of correlations between 7th grade achievement scores and what they do in 8th grade Algebra 1 achievement scores. So I sat there and was like, there's no correlation. Okay, we're going to roll with it. And I remember sitting there with those 2 teachers and saying, look, I'm going to be completely honest with you. I am literally putting my career in your hands. If this does not work, y'all are going to be here. I'm going to be the one out. And so they turned around and worked really hard. Once again, they're literally, based on the data from last year, literally the 2 best math teachers in the district. And they turned around, and it's all, once again, a part of establishing that culture of success. And so when they start saying, hey, we're already doing high school stuff, I've got a leg up when I go to high school next year, because instead of doing Algebra 1, I'm going in geometry. I've still got to take 4 years of math, so I'm going to go geometry, Algebra 2, advanced math, and either statistics, trigonometry, or something along those lines. And I'll tell the students this year, because I have an 8th grade student of my own in another school, I said, I'm honestly, when y'all are applying for scholarships, I'm giving you a leg up over my own son. I was like, so make sure that you're doing what you need to do to act like you need to be in an Algebra 1 class. So those are the biggest things as far as when we look at the autonomy of hiring and going out and getting the best teacher available. whether they're from a cooperative program or a lifelong teacher, and a curricular autonomy as far as the Algebra 1 and those kind of things.
I hope all of you understand what that the historic challenges within education have been enough to know to have the autonomy to hire and fire their teachers. I mean, it just sounds so obvious, but it's a radical culture shift. And at the Hyde Foundation, we like to think that there are three basic levers for driving change. One is creating innovative school models. You see examples of this up here. Another is the human capital pipeline. How do you have a robust pipeline of great teachers and great leaders? And the final piece is around policy. How do you support the public policies that are gonna support the infrastructure to do that? Just to comment for a second, and I'm going to ask Chris to comment on this. So the human capital pipeline is huge. It's a huge challenge. We've demonstrated we can do this with more than a handful of schools. But how are we going to get to using the Achievement School District, using the iZone? How are we going to get to a place where there are thousands of new teachers performing at high levels and driving change? And I want Chris to comment on that.
Sure. I think, well, first of all, the good news is we finally get to hire people that we, get to choose. The bad news is we finally get to hire people that the fact that this is like a big aha is, and we're in 2013, I think says a lot about just what's been happening for the last 20 years. And, when you talk a lot about charters and different types of schools, I think people really focus in on the parent and family choice. And I think the part that gets lost on people is that there's choices now for teachers. Last year when we were making job offers to our teachers to come work at an ASD school, one of the ones that we were running, every single one of those teachers had an offer from somebody else. And they were asking us questions like, what's the value prop? Like, why should I come work for you and not work at Gestalt or at Chickasaw or at Freedom Prep or, pick a school? And, when teachers are starting to ask those questions and all of us are competing for talent, that's how you make teaching the kind of profession that every single one of us in here want it to be. Because now there's competition for talent, which is along with the policy changes we just made around hiring, where when you come out of college, you don't click on the website of a district and see what you're making 20 years from now, whether you're good or breathe another day, but actually we can have differentiated comp and pay people for performance. When you couple those two things together and the market starts to drive how we pay our most talented people, now, again, teachers are going to start to be paid what they deserve. And I think what that's going to do is it's going to start to attract a different type of person into higher ed and getting into teaching, because to me, it's about who are we recruiting to the table to begin with and how are we keeping people in the profession. If you look at the best systems in the world, Finland, Korea, pick a place, right? The top third of college graduates are going into education. In the United States, typically, it's the bottom third of graduates that are going into education. And if we don't flip that paradigm, right, we can do all the innovating we want. We're not going to have the talent we need to be able to get the job done. So when we can start to recruit different types of people into education, because there's a differentiated merit-based comp structure now that's going to attract ambitious, goal-driven people and not someone that is satisfied with what they're going to make 20 years from now, whether they do well or not, then that's going to start to change the game. And then the second thing is we got to keep them, right? And I think that's the biggest challenge. This is tough work. This would be like a doctor doing their entire career in the ER. These are trauma centers when you look at the types of issues that our teachers have to deal with day in and day out. So once we start to get the talent we need in the building, then I think the big challenge is how do we keep folks in this for 5, 6, 7 years? Because to ask a teacher to teach in a bottom 5% school for 20, 30 years, that's not realistic. My mom's going to retire this year from doing this for 30 years. You can't do what we need done for a 30-year stretch. This is Navy SEAL work. It's 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and then maybe go off and do something else. And as a society, as an industry, we got to be okay with that, right? People are coming out of college now, changing jobs 6, 7, 8 times to begin with. So to expect someone that's going to sit in a classroom and teach the same thing to this, the same subject, the same grade for 30 years, that's unrealistic. So I think we have to change our expectations around who we're bringing in and what a good retention policy or goal is. And And I think you're starting to see that with some of the policy changes and the fact that now we're competing. You know, when we're all on the phone, we're all talking to that group of people. We're trying to get them to come work for us, just like you guys do. Again, I mean, this is something that you guys have dealt with, you know, every day for the last 20, 30 years, and to see it now starting to happen in education, I think is pretty exciting.
Highlight a couple of things that I've learned over the last 7 years in Tennessee. So there is a recruitment piece to this, which of course is very easy to understand on the school level, but I just want to recognize a couple of folks in the room for the recruitment they've done on a system level. First, Mayor Dean in Nashville. Teach for America was not going to be in Nashville, but for the leadership of Mayor Dean. And he was opportunistic about figuring out different pipelines of teachers that could come into his city to add value to kids. Same for the Hyde Foundation and many others that enabled Teach for America to start here. That's one thing, the recruitment. The second is conditions. Of course, the conditions in the market need to be right. We need to be able to pay teachers, you know, a wage that is, you know, recognizing their value. But I think the conditions also need to exist on the university level. And at Lipscomb University, if you look at the Tennessee Higher Education Report, and you look at which universities are producing graduates that are achieving in the classroom, which is the only measure we should look at when assessing colleges of education, Lipscomb is almost at the top of the list, if not the top of the list. We need more Lipscomb universities, we need more Memphis teacher residencies, we need more Teach for America, and that's one way that we're going to shift the conditions. If we're holding our universities accountable for producing in the classroom as well. And then finally, the culture. Our principals need to create work conditions that people want to have. So Mr. Nelson can be Josh Pastner all he wants, and he knows this, but if teachers' lived experience in the building is not one that they want to stay at, he's going to get them for 1 year and then they're going to be gone. So like we need to do all three of those things at a very high level so that we have an entire marketplace of great teachers coming into our system.
It's a portfolio district. I think it's one where there's several networks of operators, and our primary job is to recruit talent to the system, whether that's individual teachers or folks that can run networks of schools. And then we got to create the right accountability framework that's fair, that holds schools accountable for results. There's a piece in there around just sort of equity and access, meaning if you have, you know, a system where 40, 50, 60% of the parents have options, parents need to know what those options are, and they've got to be clear. Folks have to be able to easily access the system, and then we've got to make sure our schools aren't playing games with things like expulsion rates and SPED, and, you know, not serving certain kids that may be harder to serve. And so part of our job is to, you know, the analogy I use is we need to be the health inspector, not the restaurant operator, right? And in a district, you play both roles, right? You're the health inspector, but you're also running all the restaurants. And so when we're in our own chili too much, it becomes hard to make good decisions, right? So our job in the ASD is, you know, right now we're running a few schools, but really it's to be the health inspector. It's to set the conditions, it's to set the rules, it's to make sure people are following the rules, and it's to, you know, if there's great restaurants, we want to help that great restaurant grow and serve more kids. If it's a lousy restaurant, or in this case school, it needs to be either replaced by somebody else or closed, and that's our job. And so it's much more about regulating and setting conditions and less about having a monopolistic operator that who's, you know, when you get in that situation, your job becomes protect what you have and not necessarily serve kids. And I think the last thing I want to say, which is why I think Memphis in particular has really embraced this, and I hope continues to, is the conversation here is less, I think, than what you see in other places around what type of school. Like we should care less about what type of school it is. I don't care if it's a charter school or traditional public school. There's great charters and there's lousy charters. There's great traditional public schools, there's lousy ones. There's great private schools, there's lousy ones. You know, schools for scholarship, Jubilee. We should have all of them, and they should all be good. And the ones that are good, we should help, you know, more of those grow. And the ones that are bad, we need to eliminate. It doesn't matter type. What we need to be concerned about as a leaders, you know, you guys are leaders, community, is what are the outcomes? What are the results? And that should be the focus of the conversation. I think in too many places, we get hung up on type of school and this and that, and we take our eye off the ball. We need to care about results and not what kind of school it is.
Dollar for dollar, I'm not sure, because the state has school improvement grants that are helping support the work inside of our innovation zone schools. But the way that the budget is distributed to our principals in the I-zone, and I said this earlier, Philip doesn't have the same budget flexibility that an ASD principal has. Because a lot of his budget is being tied up in central office services, some of which I imagine he would actually buy into if he was given the choice. Some maybe not, I'm not exactly sure, but what I would want to do over time is make sure that the conditions across the portfolio are the same, so that Mr. Nelson and Roblin schools and Derwin schools all have the same operating conditions, the same flexibility to do what they need with the budget, and the same accountability.
Or now, up until recently, they would have had to have been forced placed, but that's no longer the case. With the changes we've made around collective bargaining and tenure, there's no forced placement anymore. So if you don't get rehired by us, you're a free agent. You got to go out and convince someone they should hire you. Again, that's how the real world works, right? So, you're a free agent. Nice. And the answer is they reapply. And now this wasn't the case previously, but there's no forced placement. So if they don't get hired by us, then they've got to go out and they can, try and get a job in an I-zone school, a charter school, Shelby County, Tipton County. I mean, again, there's choices, right? But it's incumbent upon them to figure out what those choices are and to get hired. They don't just automatically get a job because we didn't hire them.
But for us, what we try to do is grow from within. For instance, right now, one of our other schools, Klondike, we have Klondike Elementary School. We currently have a principal who is a star principal in the district, but we also have a dean who was with us as a dean in one of our middle schools at Power Center Academy. And so Power Center Academy, since it's one of our flagship schools, our earlier model, she understands the culture, the model, she understands, what our end product, our outcome should look like. And so she's now partnered with that principal in this Achievement School District school to, one, do the turnaround work, but also bring culture to light. And so eventually the idea is that when we start another elementary school, she'll be the principal of that elementary school. But then in one of our high schools at Power Center Academy High, one of our deans was a teacher with us for 3 years through Teach for America. And so when we talk about retention, typically TFA, there's a 2 years and you're out. That's the idea. But as Chris and Brad mentioned, if culture is intact, then you can really keep great people. And so this teacher that could have gone on elsewhere is now sticking with us in the education space, but also providing more support to our teachers to do the great work that he was doing. And so the idea is to grow from within, but we know that this work is so massive that we can't bring everybody from within, and everybody really isn't cut out to be a leader at the school level. Maybe there's nothing wrong with being an instructor for as long as you want to be an instructor. There's nothing wrong with being a dean forever. But some people are really born to be leaders, and either we identify them from outside or we grow them from within.
Just 2 quick comments, actually. The first is that by changing the conditions, you open up the pool of people that you're actually going to be able to recruit. So if you say to a leader, I'm going to decide your strategy, I'm going to decide who you can hire, and I'm going to decide your budget, the population of people you're going to get to be able to run that system, very small. When you open up the conditions, the people who are likely to be attracted are different. But we also are building out partnerships with really strong programs like New Leaders for New Schools. Most of our I-Zone principals actually are from the New Leaders program, and when you look at the gains across the innovation zone, level 5 across the zone, double-digit gains in math, double-digit gains in science, double-digit gains in social studies, greater than state growth in reading. That's in part because of strong pipelines like New Leaders who take on the task also of training up their principals to be really effective CEOs.
I think it's a place where you don't need to work 16 hours a day and come home mentally, physically, emotionally exhausted. Now, I may be wrong. That may be every school, and if it is, then I think that says a lot about much bigger issues that none of us are able to solve up here in the next 15 minutes. But I think it's finding a place where it's not quite as intense. And hopefully, once you get the school cultures turned around and you get that flywheel spinning to kind of continue on the Jim Collins language, then maybe even in those same schools it takes a little bit less effort. But this is startup work. This is this is turnaround work. That's tough work. And so I think we just have to. The reason I mention this, I think we just have to be realistic in our expectations around if we're going to go out and recruit en masse folks that are willing to do that we understand that it's probably not a 20 or 30 year run. and that's okay. That we shouldn't beat ourselves up if that's the case. We just need to adapt how we're recruiting and what we're doing to deal with that reality. And I think sometimes we want to push a round peg in a square, whatever that saying is, and not accept the fact that this isn't maybe a 20 or 30 year run for a teacher to work in one of the schools that we're talking about.
And just really quickly, I mean, if we just shifted over, instead of Navy SEAL, we said Marine, once a Marine, always a Marine, right? If we look at the front lines as being the classroom, then, it is difficult to be on the front lines for 20 years. But maybe you're on the front lines for 3 years and you learn about strategy, you learn about leadership there, and then you grow outside of that space and you're still a Marine, you're still an educator, but now you're just serving in a different capacity. So the idea is to retain educators, but maybe not in the same space.
It's not necessarily, I wouldn't call it change. I would say very clear expectations is what we do. So it's very clear expectations. When we meet, our dean of students or our head of school meets with every single family that comes in the building. Very time intensive, but worth it. Every minute is worth it. And what our meetings entail, what are our expectations of you as a parent? And the basic expectation is that they get them to school on time, in uniform, ready to go. And it's our job to educate them. And then the other side of that is what they can expect from us. And so the bottom line is you have that initial meeting, but you're also constantly reinforcing those expectations. So, little Lisa gets to school 5 minutes late. We're picking up the phone. What's going on? What do we need to do? Do we need to give you a morning wake-up call to make sure she gets here on time? So it's a matter of the expectations and not necessarily, a lot of people think of parent engagement as parents are volunteering. They're doing things with the PTO. For us, it's you're constantly engaged in your child's education. So we can pick up the phone anytime, constantly remind you of those expectations and hold you to that standard. The same with our kids. You hold them to a ridiculously high standard, they're going to meet it and or exceed it. It's the same with our parents. You hold them to that standard, you let them know the expectation, and they're going to meet it or exceed it.
So for us, it's just really continuing what we're doing throughout the year. So at Power Center, for instance, it's a business model. A couple of months ago, the Commercial Appeal put out an article about 2 of our scholars, 6th graders and 8th graders, who started their own. They're the youngest owners of a food truck in Memphis. They're too young to drive the food truck. Their mom has to drive them, but they drive it. And so they're taking the business principles that they learned during the year, and in the summertime, quite frankly, they're making a ton of money and doing something productive and giving back to the community. And they're doing the work. They're working in the community that we serve.
That's one of the things, because of where we took the school over, that I'm able to focus on now that we're starting to have some of the gains that we're having. The question was, what does parent engagement look like? So one of the things I did with my Title I money, I just received 6th graders, which is a challenge and a blessing all in its own. But mainly because of the simple fact that the last 2 years I've had 7th and 8th grade only. So you add more numbers, so now to raise student achievement and raise those numbers, you now have to get those 6th grade students along to buy in and those kind of things. But fortunately, the feeder pattern sets up real nicely to where a lot of those students are already coming in proficient and advanced. But one of the other advantages is I get some additional Title I funds. And so with my Title I funds, I sat down and I said, the one thing that we have not been doing very well the last 2 years is getting our parents involved in the school and getting the community involved in the school. We've raised from about 3 adopters to about 7 or 8 adopters in the 2 years I've been there. But outside of that, the parental involvement hasn't been great. It's been okay, it hasn't been great. And so I hired a family service specialist. And so I'm letting that family service specialist work programs and those kind of things to raise the raise the parental involvement, and then in turn also help raise the student achievement, because we all know the research says the more parents you have involved, the higher the student achievement normally is.
I think we have to think about a system differently than we have in the past. The public education system that we grew up in, if we went to public school, has to adapt and change. If you were to come back here, let's say you were alive 100 years ago and you came back, if you went and bought groceries, it would look different. If you went to an airport, it would look different. If you went anywhere in the world in anything, it would look different. The one thing that would probably look the same is you'd walk into a school and you'd say, yep, looks about like it did when I was here. And that's a problem. And so we have to be able to recognize that it's time for a different system. It's not one operator, it's several operators. Charter schools or public schools. And we've got to have choice within the system, not just for kids and parents, but for educators, because it's going to attract talent that would otherwise never even think about getting into education. And if we don't solve the talent issue, we're not going to solve the culture issue, and we're not going to solve the achievement issue. education, bottom line, is a people business, and if we don't have the right folks with the right training, which, again, amen, what's happening at Lipscomb, then we're going to be having the same conversation 10 years from now. And so the only way we open it up is to create choice within the public education system, and we have to be okay with that. We've got to get past the what type of school it is fights, because what's happening here is systemic. And you could set this panel up in any other place and have good stories about what's happening. This is systemic change, and there's not many places in the state or in the country where you can have that conversation. We haven't done it yet, so it's way too early to declare victory, but we're creating the conditions for that to happen, and I think that's huge. And so air cover, support, this is gonna get, fierce, and we just need people in leadership roles to understand that. This isn't gonna happen over lunches and glasses of wine. These are tough conversations and tough fights. And when they happen, people have to be willing to step up and stand for something. And at the end of the day, we gotta stand for kids and not people's jobs.